Resource Manager deployments, which do allow you to kind of get into that data plane operations if desired. So very, very high level, what is Azure Resource Manager? So, how do we deploy things into Azure? And there are a couple different ways. And again, all of these going through that ARM data plane or a control plane. So the first is we do have REST endpoints available. And there's actually, there's tons of them. So we've got like REST endpoints for individual services, but we also have kind of a unique REST endpoint that is a deployment endpoint, which you can basically create any service through. And there are some advantages to doing that, to using that deployment endpoint. And I'll quickly show this in the first demo. We also have software development kits, so Python, .NET, Java, and Go are some of the big ones. We've got a command line interface tool, so the Azure CLI. If you're a PowerShell user, we've got PowerShell modules, and we can deploy Azure resources into Azure using all of those. And then finally, what we're here for is the Azure Resource Manager Templates, which is our kind of like first party infrastructure as code solution for doing infrastructure as code type deployments to Azure. I guess this is a good point to talk about, like, a question that we often hear is like, okay, I've got all of these. Why would I use Azure Resource Manager Templates over, like, let's say, the Azure CLI or the Azure PowerShell module? And that's usually the one that gets the question, like, why would I use the CLI or Azure Resource Manager Templates? And it really comes down to, that concept of infrastructure as code and kind of the tenets behind infrastructure as code, which are things like declarative deployments, idempotent deployments, having a contract or a document on how I want my environment to look, and being able to kind of like just make it so, like, here's my infrastructure as code asset, in this case an ARM template. It defines all the resources and the configuration for those resources. Now just make Azure so, like, just make it match this. And then, there is this, I use this term idempotency. And so once I've got this contract and I've applied it to my Azure subscription, maybe I want to make just a small change to one of those resources. And so I make it in that template, and then I can reapply that, and it changes just that one little thing. Or maybe nothing changes and I redeploy the ARM template. And again, kind of using this idempotent nature, Azure Resource Manager is going to look at the contract, look at the subscription, and come back and say, hey, there's nothing to change here. We're already in a good state. Whereas if I was to try to use like the command line interface or the PowerShell modules to do the same, like bring me the same characteristics or that idempotent nature, a lot of the heavy lifting would be up to me as the automation author. So, if I'm using PowerShell, I would have to do things like, they're just good practices, but it is a lot of extra work. Like, it's not just as simple as I want to deploy this virtual machine. To do it right, you're going to want to, like, first make sure the virtual machine doesn't already exist before you deploy it. And already we can see, like, our lines of code are starting to increase. And there are other, important factors of infrastructure as code, but that I think, idempotency is one of the big ones that stands out. So that's Azure Resource Manager Templates, and we're going to dig in further. And there are, technically other solutions for deploying into Azure, such as Terraform and Pulumi. Technically, at some point, these are using SDK assets. So, there's some relationship between, kind of the bottom of the list and then the top of the list. But I did want to call out that there are a bunch of other, non-first party solutions to do similar infrastructure as code type things, and they're all good. So that's our deployment options. So really quickly, let's just look at a quick demo. And I might even just show the code. I might not even really deploy anything here. And really the scope here is to look at, like, okay, we've got REST interfaces. And I can certainly do this, but certainly there's a better way. And kind of my goal is to kind of show the before and after, with the better way being ARM templates. So this is just a really quick, simple PowerShell script to deploy a storage account into Azure. Up here, I'm just getting a couple secrets, just some authentication things from Azure Key Vault, which is a native Azure key secret store. And this is really just all of this up here is just authentication stuff. I'm building a very simple header, and you can see here's kind of the body of the request that I'm going to make. And what we're deploying here is a storage account. So there's a couple things that I need to define on that storage account, like what's the SKU, what's the kind, and where am I going to define it or deploy it at. I then have the URI to the REST API that will take in this storage account definition and create it. And you can see here, you can even like start to pick out some of the Azure specific stuff on the API. So we've got providers, Microsoft.storage, storage account. I'm going to give it a storage account name, which I've defined in this variable up here, and select the API version. And what this API version is you're going to see this all over my demonstrations, is just like as we revision the storage account resource type, like maybe we add a property or a new capability, it's going to get a new API version. And using our REST APIs or Azure Resource Manager templates, you can have fine control over which version of that resource that you're deploying. And then finally, I'm just going to invoke my REST method to make it so. So it's not super duper difficult, but as you got into like more complex deployments, I mean, there's a lot of overhead here. I talked about two different types of REST APIs for interfacing with Azure. The first one being that service-specific one, so we can see, again, Microsoft.storage, storage accounts. We also have another one that's much more generalized. So we can see Microsoft.resources, deployments. And essentially what I'm doing here is providing it with the ARM template itself. If I have an ARM template, I can certainly go through this specific REST API as well. But there are easier ways to deploy Azure resources or Azure Resource Manager templates, which we'll see. So rather than making the REST call against the API, we've got native commands, we've got portal support, a bunch of different ways to make this easier. I will, though, call out a couple things about this deployment API. If you are interested in like making raw REST calls to Azure, there are some benefits in using this API versus the service level one, such as we have this like pre-fighting capability, or this specific API has this pre-fighting capability such that it will do some checks, like is this storage account name in use across Azure? And it's up to like the service teams to define what those pre-flight checks are, but it's kind of just like an added bonus. And what's cool about that is if I was to, make this call, it's going to do run all those checks prior to actually starting the deployment, which is going to give me that feedback that something's wrong much quicker than if I went through one of the service-specific ones. But again, we have the capabilities. We can make, just like native REST calls and get stuff deployed into Azure. I won't do it. I mean, it's pretty simple. I'd run a PowerShell script, and then I would pull up the portal, and boom, you would see there's a storage account there. But, the point is we can also do better, make it easier, and that's where ARM templates come into play. So let's talk about ARM templates. What are they? So ARM templates, as I mentioned earlier, really are our first party or our native like infrastructure as code mechanism for deploying and managing resources in Azure. So just like any kind of modern infrastructure as code solution like Terraform or ARM, or I don't have a whole lot of experience with CloudFormation, but I'm assuming CloudFormation as well, and AWS. Here we're kind of making a very declarative contract or document in how we want our resources deployed into Azure. excuse me. I already talked about the idempotent nature of it. Using ARM templates, or an ARM template itself will build a dependency graph, meaning that as our solutions get complex and we've got multiple resources and maybe one depends on the other, maybe it's a storage account needs to be created before a VM is created that's going to access that storage account, we can build in those dependencies. And the cool thing is where those dependencies don't exist. So if I've got like a big template with 30 resources in it and only a couple of them depend on each other, we're going to get some parallelism in the deployments. Meaning if I have two resources that can be deployed independently of each other, that's going to happen. And again, you don't have to worry about that. I mean, as long as you're building your dependencies appropriately, which we'll see how to do in the demonstration, ARM's going to take care of that for you. So ARM templates can be built in a modular way. We can, build kind of like a parent ARM template that then calls and deploys separate child templates. And this can be really useful if you want to build like a module registry for, maybe you want to define what networks look like in your Azure subscription, your Azure tenants, and you want to kind of adhere to one kind of network construct. You can build that in a template and then use that in other places. I talked briefly about the extensibility of ARM templates. Really, right now our extensibility surface is a specific resource called the deployment script resource, which allows us, like I said earlier, to run arbitrary code alongside with our ARM deployments. ARM templates have day one support, and I think this is a big factor in why some people choose ARM over other tooling like Terraform. And what we mean by day one support is there's really no abstraction between ARM templates and the ARM APIs themselves. And this is both like a good thing, but it's also contributes to some of the difficult nature of ARM templates, which I will address. But kind of, digging in there a little bit more, when we revision a resource, I'll just use an example from my life. There was one point where I had to do some work with Azure Container Instances, which is like a service, if you've not used it or heard of it, where we can just host a container in Azure without like a Kubernetes cluster or any kind of infrastructure behind it. You just kind of get a single container with an endpoint if you want that endpoint. And I was doing a big project in not ARM, in a different infrastructure as code solution, and some changes had been made to that resource, to the ACI resource, and I needed to take advantage of those changes in my deployments. However, the solution that I was using at the time had this abstraction layer between the REST Azure Surface and the infrastructure as code runtime. That abstraction was just a provider. And there was a delay in when Azure was revisioned. Somebody actually had to go in fact, it was me, had to go in and update the provider with the new API version for that resource. And it was quite a significant delay. So we don't have those in Azure. We revision something in Azure. ARM templates can take advantage of that in the deployments almost immediately. So we do have some validation and testing tools, which we'll talk about here. Deployment history. So using, this is another, we talked about the different REST APIs, kind of the service specific ones, and then the deployment REST API. Another advantage of using that deployment REST API, which ARM templates do, is that we track the history of those deployments in Azure. And then there's just many, many other things. So, what are my options for authoring an Azure Resource Manager template? Actually, I want to expand on one thing before we move forward, and that is the day one resourcing support and the fact that there is no abstraction between what we're writing in our template and what the REST APIs are expecting. So there's not a provider, there's not like anything in the middle that's kind of shaping the REST calls for us. So while that's great because we get day one support, the obvious kind of disadvantage of it though, and you can even see it here in my screenshot, is just that it does mean that as we're authoring our resources, they have a very kind of like API looking feel to them. In other words, we don't really have like a flat like name value, type value, API value, tags value. We do kind of have to author these. Like we kind of expose some of the complexities of the REST APIs in ARM templates. And it is unfortunate because the REST APIs are complex. There's a lot of complexities in there. The storage resource, which we can see on the screen right now, is a pretty simple one. But as you get into like more complicated resources like an AKS cluster or an Azure virtual machine, which is actually a combination of several resources, you know, it can be kind of daunting to work with that API structure, and building the ARM template can be a little difficult. So we've got two things, which is kind of a good segue into the next slide. We're investing heavily in ARM templates right now. And I would say to kind of address some of these difficulties, we've done two big things. One is the VS Code extension, which I work on, or I'm responsible for. And we'll see in the demonstration, we talked about Azure Resource Manager schemas earlier on. So the tools that we're going to see uses those schemas to really help you understand and discover the API surface as you're authoring those tools. But the second thing is that at Build, which just happened, I don't know, within the last month or two, we announced that we're also embarking on an ARM template language revision. So you'll see that ARM templating language is really JSON-like. It's not JSON. I mean, it was JSON at one point, but we've added things to it. But we basically, you know, built a language from JSON, which is not, it's not great. There's some issues there. So we are also now investing in revising this language with the goal of making authoring ARM templates easier. But that's going to be a little ways out. So what are our options now? We've got a awesome extension for VS Code. You know, I would say, you know, at this point, even objectively, it offers one of the best experiences out there right now for authoring ARM templates. We also have a Visual Studio project. So if you do work in Visual Studio, there is a project type in there, and it does have a bunch of the same features that we have in VS Code, but it does not have all of them. We've over the last couple of years have been heavily investing in VS Code and not so much in Visual Studio. Visual Studio is something I'm looking at right now, really, you know, kind of trying to figure out what to do with it. If you are a Visual Studio user, I'd love to talk to you. But, you know, at this point, it looks like there's enough usage that we are going to continue to definitely invest in Visual Studio. It might not be at the same clip as VS Code, but, you know, that's kind of in flight right now. And there are other ways to, like, you know, and it's not always just about authoring the ARM template. Just like any kind of programming language, you know, sometimes you might want samples to derive from. So we've got this thing called portal export, which is wildly popular, particularly in the beginning stages when somebody's getting ramped up on Azure Resource Manager templates. And what portal export allows you to do is really take any resource or any grouping of resources in Azure and create an ARM template from those. So like kind of like as a learning journey, you could go in and like in the portal and deploy, you know, a VM using the portal UI and then export that out as a ARM template and kind of see how things work. And you can go in and like change knobs, change settings. You know, it's a good way to just really kind of like I know I need this thing and I know how to do it in the portal, but I can't quite figure out how to do it in the ARM template. So portal export will help you. I still use it all the time. We also have an ARM quick start gallery, which is just a huge grouping of ARM templates. It's pretty daunting. There's quite a bit in there, but it's kept up to date. There's a lot of, you know, checks and CI stuff going on to get ARM templates into that quick start gallery, which really kind of helps keep that quality bar up. I've got samples in there, and I was like at the time very surprised at how difficult it was to get stuff into the quick start gallery. But now that I'm working kind of closely with that team, I understand that the quality bar needs to be high because it's very, very, very popular with customers. And then we also have template reference documents, which are generated from Swagger, which are also a good source for getting some of that stuff. Finally, once we have our ARM templates defined, what are the ways that we can deploy these? We talked about a bunch of different ways to deploy stuff to Azure. This slide here is specifically how do I deploy an ARM template? And we've got a command in the Azure CLI. We've got PowerShell commands. You can deploy a template directly in the Azure portal. That's what this screenshot is. If you were to go out to like our quick start gallery per se, and each one of the samples in there has a button deploy to Azure, all that button really does is it takes the template, opens up the Azure portal, drops it in there, and you kind of get the same experience that we can see on the screen. We've got REST interface, that deployment REST interface that I talked about. And then there's others as well, like Terraform. And that might, like why would I ever do this? Like, why? What? I can deploy an ARM template from Terraform, which Terraform is another infrastructure as code solution, but you can. And there have been situations or projects that I've been on where I was working with Terraform where I did need to deploy an ARM template. In my cases, it always came down to the Terraform provider, which kind of is that abstraction layer, just hadn't been updated with the resource API version that I need, or maybe it just didn't have the resource at all. So I had to, as kind of like an escape hatch, use Terraform with a little bit of ARM involved to kind of get around that, the lag in the Terraform provider. Okay, so that went on a little bit longer than I'd hoped, but I hope it was helpful. But I think what I'll do now is just kind of dig into some coding. Kind of two purposes here. ARM templates are complex. There's a lot. I mean, it is its own little language. There's a lot going on in it. I won't be able to get all of it. But what I'm going to try to do is just really kind of give a high-level overview of some of the sections and things that you need to be aware of when building ARM templates. As a secondary kind of goal is I want to show off the tools that we've built for authoring ARM templates because they really do help. So if you're new to ARM templates, we'll talk about what they are. If you've used ARM templates, hopefully I'll show you some things that you haven't seen before in terms of our tooling. So I've got a directory here, sample templates. I'm just going to create a new file called Azure deploy.json. Files can be named anything. It's glaringly obvious. You can see that JSON file extension there. So obviously something is going on there, or you can kind of see the history here that this started out as just a JSON file. And notice down here that VS Code actually is recognizing this as a JSON file based on the file extension. Now you can name these files anything you want. It doesn't need to be Azure Deploy. Azure Deploy is kind of a convention, like quite a few people and organizations use Azure Deploy. So in VS Code, I actually have our extension installed here. So it's Azure Resource Manager Tools. Hard to see there. Version 0.11.0 is the latest version. And as part of these tools, we've got snippets. So in this JSON file, I'm just going to type in ARM, and we can see that a couple snippets have come up. And this is really like our scaffolding snippet that's going to really scaffold out sections of the Resource Manager template. Now, we can deploy ARM templates at a couple different scopes within Azure. In a scope is like, how do I describe this? Like, just think of them as like containers, and like the tenant is like your biggest container. And then within a tenant, you can have a management group. And then a management group can define several different subscriptions and then within a subscription, you can have several different resource groups. And so as we're building ARM templates, we need to determine what scope we're going to deploy to. In this case, I'm just going to do the resource group scope. But within here, we've got scaffolding for all the different scopes. All right, so we'll just hit that, and we've scaffolded out our most basic ARM template. This is a valid template. I can deploy this template. It's just, it would do nothing. Now, this top level schema right here is basically, you know, as we're building those REST APIs, generating the Swagger, generating those schemas, they all get kind of combined into a single document. Excuse me. And at the top of our ARM templates, we're going to define like which grouping of schemas do we want to use. And this is going to determine kind of the resources that are available. And really this 2019-04-01, if you're building ARM templates, this is the most up to date. This is the one that you probably want to use. You can get in a situation where you're using like an older one. And we'll actually, if you have like an ARM template that's kind of old and you open it up in our this tool right here, it will actually tell you that you've got an old schema and recommend that you update. But you could get into some situations, particularly as you're authoring, where the tool is going to come back and say like, hey, I see you're authoring a resource, but I don't know what that resource is, so I can't help you out with it. And that would be, you know, most likely because either A, a schema doesn't exist, which it does happen, and we're trying really hard to fix that, or you've got an older root level schema here, which just doesn't know about that resource. I really want to focus on a couple things here. So parameters, this is like if I need to bring data in, if I need to ask users questions and use the answers in my deployment, that's what a parameter is. A function is not, I'm not going to focus or really do anything with these, but like if you've got, a good example would be like if you're concatenating a bunch of string data and you're going to do that several different places within your template, you can create a function that just does that once, kind of a user-defined function. So rather than having to have all that concatenation code, you know, spread out through your template, you define it in your function and you just call the function. But we won't see an example of that. So I'm actually just going to remove that from the template. Variables work very much like parameters. It just holds a value. The difference here is this is kind of like the parameter. We can actually bring in data from the outside, where variables are defined inside of the template. And we you know, the only way to manipulate a variable kind of at deployment time is if a variable references the parameter itself. The next section here is resources, and this is where we're going to define all our resources, kind of where all of the real work happens. And then finally, we've got outputs. And outputs will do a couple things. It will return data to the screen, but it will also, like we talked about, like deployments and how we log the deployments. Like you can go get your output. Excuse me. You can get your output from the deployment, the historical deployments in Azure. But as well, we talked about modularity. So if I am stringing a bunch of templates together, I can take the output from one and use it as the input, parameter input on another one. So that's like the basic building blocks of a template. So let's go ahead and add a resource. And I'm just going to add a storage resource here, and I'm going to use snippets to do this. So I'll just type storage, and I can see my snippet, and boom, there is my storage resource. And I'll walk through this resource really quickly. So all Azure resources are going to have a couple things in common. They're going to have a name, a type, which defines the type of resource, an API version. We don't necessarily need a tag, but we do have a tag in this snippet. And this is just a tag on that resource, which can be used for like organizational purposes or like automation. Like if you want to like go through your subscription and find everything that belongs to an individual cost center, you can put tags on your resources that indicate the cost center. We then have a location, which is our different Azure resource data centers around the world, and the location in which you want to deploy this. And then we've got some stuff in here that's very specific to the storage account. So like what kind of storage account do we want to deploy? Some information about the SKU. Now I used a snippet to create this, but let's I really want to now dig into kind of how we're utilizing Azure schemas to help author ARM templates. So again, just to kind of recap, as we're building the REST interfaces, Swagger is generated, and then we're generating schemas from that Swagger. So when we ship this extension, we ship it with all of those schemas, so they're actually on disk. And it allows us to do two really important things and really helpful things. First, validate your deployments or validate how you've defined this resource prior to you deploying it. The last thing you want to do is deploy a resource or deploy a template, like walk away to go get breakfast and come back and realize it failed. So we want to catch a lot of that stuff up front, but also help provide IntelliSense or completions on these things. So like if I come in here to this kind right here, I'm going to remove storage v2. We can already see that I have a problem. So we got a little yellow squiggly under here, and we can see that it's telling us what these values must be. Like we're missing a valid value here. So we're pulling this from the Azure schemas. So I can come back in here and hit Control Space and then tab through these and select the one I want. Or let's say I wanted to get like really advanced and go far in the future and use a storage v3 account. Once again, I'm going to get that warning that like, hey, this is not a valid value for this property. You must use one of the valid values. And I mean, this is pretty incredible stuff. I've been authoring ARM templates for a long time. Never had these luxuries or these nice things. So it's pretty awesome. In fact, you could even, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in here, but if we wanted to, we could start constructing an Azure resource from scratch using these schemas. So like, as if I did like Kubernetes, AKS, sorry about that. Yeah, so like AKS cluster. Oh, that's the wrong thing. That actually pulled in a snippet. I'll just grab one of these from the top. Redis. Oh, this is pulling in snippets. So we're actually, just today, we're working on, I'll call out one of the issues with snippets because I'm hitting it right now. So we do have snippets here, but they're very basic. Like I can add any snippet anywhere. So you can see like right here, I'm adding a Redis resource to my parameter section, which is not a valid configuration. So coincidentally, just now in my demo, I hit an issue that we are in the process of fixing. So we're building in some contextualization to our snippets so that you can only add parameters in parameter fields, variables in variable fields, and then resource snippets under the resource block. But where I was trying to go is that using these schemas, it is possible to construct these resources by hand. I don't know that I would do it, but you could do it. I would, find a sample, use a snippet or whatnot. So let me just go ahead and add another resource in here. I'm just going to keep it simple and add another storage account. So we've got storage account 1, storage account 2. I'll just call this one 1, 2, 3. And our snippets have a little bit of like tab contextualization on them, or tab stops that help us configure them. So what I want to show now is that, like, let's say I had a dependency between these two, in that I needed storage account 1 to deploy before storage account test 1, 2, 3. So as I mentioned, we can build a dependency graph into these things. So I will just come in here and just open up some quotes, and using schemas, it's offering me up the properties that I can add right here. And I'll select depends on. And just fill this out. And so now I just need to create a dependency on this storage account up here. Now I could just use the name, but I'm going to use the resource ID. So for every resource that we create in Azure, we generate an ID for that resource. And one of the reasons I prefer to use resource IDs, because technically I could have another resource type, like maybe a virtual machine with the same name. So I can share names across resources. Not a good practice, but Just to combat that, I think convention is to use the resource ID. It'll also show off some cool completions that we have in Azure. So do resource ID, and using the VS Code extension, we have completions to kind of help build some of these longer strings. So what it's done now is it's discovered all the resources in my template. I can hit a comma, and then of that resource type, I can specify the specific resource, and boom, there I have my dependency. So now if I was to go deploy this, it would deploy this one first and then this one second. Whereas if I was to remove this, they would deploy in parallel. Cool. So that was like a whirlwind tour. I mean, I just covered, didn't do it justice. There's a lot more we can do there, but what I hope to, what I hope to have landed is kind of some of the different sections of an ARM template. They can kind of see here how I build out my resources, how I can build dependencies between those. And we do have the ability, like if I deploy like a storage account, and then I'm deploying like a web app, and I need to set, like configure that web app to access the storage account. So I need like the endpoint and the connection, the endpoint and the secrets to access that storage account. We've got ways to do that in Azure. So I can consume like output from one resource as input to another resource. Cool. So once I have these, I've got a couple different options, like I said, for deploying them. I could copy this out to the portal and deploy it via the portal. I could also just use like an Azure command. So Azure AZ deployment group. Create template file, and then give it the location of the template file, and then the resource group that I want to deploy it into. And I'll tell you what, just to make this go a little bit quicker, because I need this for the next part of my demo, I'm just going to remove and just keep this as a simple single resource. And I'll go ahead and deploy that. And so now the Azure CLI is and so I would imagine what's going on here is that the storage account name is already taken, because I just took the name from the snippet. So storage accounts have to have unique names all the way across Azure. However, I'm glad this happened, because this is an example of that pre-flight API. And there are just some things that we can't catch during the authoring experience. Unfortunately, this is one of those. Let's also use this as an opportunity to generalize this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and add a parameter. I'll just call it name. I'm just going to remove the metadata. Probably best practice to keep it in there, but let's just leave it out for simplistic stakes. And I'll give it a default value, just something that I think will be unique. So now I've defined a parameter, and I want to consume that parameter down here on the resource name. So I've got a function called parameters, where I just define the function and then define the parameter that I want to use. I didn't talk too much about functions, but we've got a couple in here. We've got resource group.location. So you can see, using the resource group function, I can dynamically determine the location and where that resource group is created. I've got parameters. We've got a bunch of like the things that you would expect in any kind of programming language, like concat, sum. I mean, there's just a ton of functions that you can use inside of an ARM template, and we've got those well documented. So let me go ahead and save this and try that deployment again. All right, this time it looks like things are working a little bit better. So while this runs, I'm going to jump back over to slides, and I know we're kind of getting up against the hour. Is it okay if I go just a little bit over, given that we started a little late?
Yeah, definitely, that's fine. We have till
7:30ish. right, cool. Really appreciate that flexibility. And it shouldn't be too bad. It should just be about 10 more minutes here. Okay, so and again, that was quick. That was a lot. I did want to show off a couple other cool capabilities here. The next one is ARM What If. I just do these slides in really quickly. I apologize, they're kind of boring to look at, but we'll look at a demo. And so ARM What If is really, if you've used Terraform, Terraform has this cool feature called Terraform Plan, which just basically shows you what's going to happen if you like redeploy or if you deploy or redeploy a Terraform configuration. So like in the previous example, we had a storage account. If I was to go add another storage account, you know, it'd be cool if I can get some feedback that let's say I added a storage account and then I could run ARM What If to see what's going to change. And if it came back and said like, hey, you're about to delete a Kubernetes cluster, obviously I did something wrong and I want to like address that before I kind of move forward. So ARM What If gives us that like previewing capability to see what we're about to do before we do it. ARM What If is available in a PowerShell module, CLI, and we've got SDK support as well. It is a feature that's currently in preview, but it's pretty neat. The next thing I want to talk about is ARM Template Toolkit, and this is something I'm super duper excited about. In what the ARM Template Toolkit allows us to do is really just kind of apply some best practices. You know, I wouldn't quite call it like unit testing, but like, you know, I've tried several times to like determine what's the best way for, you know, testing my infrastructure without deploying it. And, you know, particularly like in a CI pipeline, and, you know, it's difficult. So the ARM Template Toolkit is, you know, an attempt to kind of help us define best practices for our templates, maybe check for certain things that we don't want to occur in our templates. Like an example would be, in the last demo, I created a parameter of type string, and then to pass in the storage account name. But there are certain circumstances where you want to pass in sensitive data. So we also have a parameter type of secure string. So you may want to like use ARM Template Toolkit, or you may want to enforce some rules that if a parameter has a name of like admin or password, that you want to enforce that it's using the secure string type versus the string type. So secure string just prevents it from being like echoed on the screen or keeps it out of logging and whatnot. So ARM Template Toolkit is a set of best practices that we can run our templates through prior to deploying them. It is extensible, so it comes with a set of checks. You can write your own checks. Right now, ARM Template Toolkit it's all PowerShell based. I don't know if there's any intention of changing that in the future, but it is PowerShell based. So if you want to write your own checks, they need to be written in PowerShell. And then there is some integration with Azure DevOps. In particular, community members built an extension that in a very slick way integrates this with Azure DevOps CI pipelines. But just based on the tooling nature, you could conceivably use this in any CI solution to make sure that you're enforcing the practices that you want to enforce prior to deployment. And we'll take a look at both of these in a demo. So let's see how our deployment went. So we can see that things are looking pretty good. I got this big JSON response. Let me pull over the portal here real quick. I had an existing resource group. We'll take a look at that. It says REST Demo 1, but it's just the resource group that I chose. Yep, and here is my storage account. We can see that the name matches up. Everything looks good. So now let's use that deployment and look at some of these other things that I just talked about. And I actually have the commands ready to go. I'm not very good at typing in front of a virtual audience, so we'll use some of these. So the first thing we want to look at is what if. And let me get that resource group name again. Rest demo1. Update this command here. So we just deployed this template. Let's go ahead and run this what if command and just see what it tells. Like if I was to rerun this deployment right now, what would happen? So my command here is az deployment group what if. I then pass in the template file and then the resource group name. And there's some other configurations on there as well, but you know, for a simple demo, this serves our purposes. We can see that it's in preview. If you've used Terraform and you've used Terraform Plan, there's a very significant difference between how Terraform does Terraform Plan and we do what if. And you may have noticed even that took a little while, like that didn't return immediately. With Terraform, when you do like a Terraform plan or a Terraform apply, a state file is created. You know, generally that state file would be stored like in some sort of secured storage location because it does have information about the deployment in it. And Terraform Plan is kind of using your Terraform configuration and comparing it to that state file to give you the delta. So there is some management overhead of that state file. Whereas what if here, we're actually, there is no state file. We're actually using the REST APIs themselves to kind of determine the deltas, which it is awesome because there is no state file management. However, on our end, it introduced a lot of complexities because, you know, we deployed a simple storage account with just a couple of little simple properties on it. But if we were to actually go do like a git on this storage account, it's going to come back with a whole bunch of additional properties that were set just kind of by default. So there was this kind of this noise suppression exercise that we had to go through to kind of like fine tune our results. I wasn't involved, but I kind of, as an outsider, I could tell it was a lot of work, but I think it was worth it because in the end, you know, again, we were able to get this without managing that state file. So I ran it, and we can see basically, you know, there's a couple things going on here, but there was no change. But now let's go in, and I'll just do something simple like remove this tag. I'll just clean up my screen and run the command again. And it's going to come back and tell us that we're going to remove that tag off of that object. Obviously, I have a very simple example. More practical would be, let's see, it says no change. That's interesting. I thought there would be a change. All right, let's just do something more interesting and just remove the resource itself. And if it comes back and says that there's no change, I've done something wrong. I won't debug it given our time constraints here, but it does work and should come back. Yeah, there we go. Ignore. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what's going on with that. It should have come back and said like, hey, you're deleting something. But in any regards, that was on me, not the technology. But that's what if. Let me go ahead and put my tag back in there. And then lastly, let's take a look at the ARM template toolkit. Now it is a PowerShell module. So I'm gonna go ahead and import that. Let me first start up my PowerShell session. I am on a Macintosh here running PowerShell, which I know it's not, you know, it's old news, but I still think it's pretty dang cool as a longtime PowerShell user. So I'll go ahead and import that module. And then, so I've just got a very simple little command here, test AZ template, and I'm gonna give it the template path. And again, we're not making any calls to Azure. We're not hitting any REST interfaces or anything like that. This is just purely taking in this template, essentially making a PowerShell object of it, and then running some rules across it. And we can see that I had something in there not work out well, and that is that location should not be hard-coded. You know, I may determine that that's not something that I want to concern myself with, and I can override that. And I'll show you here where we can find these rules. But some of the other ones in here, like min and max value are not numbers, parameters must be referenced, secure string parameters cannot have default values. Like, why make it secure if you're going to put the value in clear text? Let's go ahead and try to fix this one right here, though. I know what's going on there. So what it's complaining here is that, like, hey, you've hard-coded this location here. There's no way for anybody to override that or change that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create another parameter. Call it location. I'm going to remove that metadata just for now. I'll give it a default value. And I'm just going to use the resource group function and grab the location from that. And so essentially the same thing, we're doing the same thing here, but at deployment time, I could specify a value for this, so I could override what we're doing here and pick my own location if I wanted to. So now down here, instead of using that function, I'm going to use a parameter function and reference the parameter or the location parameter. And now I'll rerun this, and we can see that everything has now passed. Let's just, for the last thing that I'll do here, let me just show you how you can extend this, see the current tests, extend them, and we'll just see an example of one. And again, it's really just PowerShell. So once you download the module, inside of it, there's a directory called test cases. The ones that we're running as a deployment template, this create UI definition is we have the capability to create Azure Marketplace offerings, and that team is building they're using the ARM template toolkit to provide the same types of checks for the JSON that defines an Azure Marketplace offering. But what we're worried about here, what we saw was this deployment template directory. And in here, we can actually see for each check that we saw in that output, we have a script in here that provides the logic behind that check. So like location, and it's just a simple PowerShell script in here that's providing that power to us. So that was just a ton of stuff. Again, I hope it was helpful. I don't think I have anything else. So yeah, that was it. I really appreciate, again, I appreciate you having me out. And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions. I wasn't able to watch the chat, so I can actually look through that a little bit here. There was one from Casey. Can you talk about the different schema versions on the first line, or when to use a newer schema version? So Casey, I think I talked about that. Okay, so as far as how does one know that 2019-04-01 is the standard one to use when there are many more current? So there are two different schemas at play here. There's kind of the root level schema, and actually I'll show you this. And so if I come in here and grab this, and I'll just open up a browser. So all of it is in this schema is really just like pointers to all the resource schemas. So you can see in here
Neela, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, I am so sorry. Thank you for that. And share. So what I did was I came into the template. And can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can see.
All right. So I came in the template and I grabbed this schema and I just the URL for that schema, and then I dropped it into a browser. And so really that root level schema, it just contains like a pointer to all the resource specific schemas. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are let's just do a search here. And I know this is hard to see, but if we look in here, let me just grab one of these for something I know. So there's some Custo resource. I'm not familiar with it myself, but it has the resource schema of 2020-02-15. So there's really two different schemas at play. However, there is more that I can dig into, because it is a good question. And that is like, do I care about my resource API versions? And if I do, how do I know that I'm using the latest? So right now, we don't have anything that's just going to like tell you like, hey, you know, for this resource, you're using an older schema. However, we do have completions for the resource for the API version. And actually where we're getting this is from this root level schema. So we're investigating root level schema, show me all of the API versions for a storage account, and then allow me to select one. We are, in fact, again, coincidentally, just today when we were discussing, like, is there something we should do here to help people keep up to date if they want to stay up to date? You know, some people will lock in on an API version for a resource and not move away from that, or it would take like an active change control to do so. Now, the other thing that, you know, in full transparency, we do have, you know, a situation where we don't have schemas for every resource type. And it's probably like one of the biggest issues that we hear from customers with the accuracy of this tool. Meaning like, I don't know if this is a complete list, but maybe, you know, let's just say that like the storage account has a 2020 version and you put it in here. Let's do 04-01. You're going to see this is going to come back and say like, hey, that may not be a valid version. So we have a parallel effort that we're really trying to onboard every single service into, we have an auto generation pipeline that like as soon as you update your Swagger, we kick off a process to update the schemas. And we've made a ton of progress over the last 6 months, like a ton. The unfortunate part though is that like particularly, I think storage account is up to date, but like particularly when we get into some of the more complex resource providers like compute, networking, there's a lot of review that needs to go in to make sure that we're auto producing accurate schemas. And that's kind of slowing us down with some of the more complex providers, which are coincidentally some of the more used providers, but we're working pretty hard at it. And, you know, we're pretty committed to getting that done. I'm not very familiar with Zoom. Let me see if I can get back to the chat. So there's a question, can we use what if validation with multi-level nested templates? I believe the answer is yes. I mean, just knowing the team behind it, if it's not there, it's definitely on their backlog. And so we talked about the modularity of ARM templates and being able to like call multiple templates from one template. We also have this other method for deploying more than one template at a time. And this is where we would actually nest a template inside of another template. I can show you an example. I'll just build one real quick. So I've got a template. And then you can see here that I've got another template inside of that template. And so I believe that the question was like, can I use what if, you know, if I change something in this child template and I run what if against the parent template, will I pick it up? And I can't confidently say yes, but I can confidently say that if it's not there right now, it will be, because it would be a gross, just a huge gap if it wasn't. Side note, like, because we didn't really discuss this, you may ask, like, why would I ever want to nest one template inside of another template? I think one of the best examples I can come up with is, we talked earlier about deployment scopes. So I might want to do something like, you can see here, I've got schema subscription deployment. So I might want to do something in here like deploy a resource group, and we don't have a snippet just yet for resource group, and I'm not going to try to come up with one. I'm not going to try to hand off it really quickly, but let's just say we do have you can deploy a resource group as a resource. So I might deploy, but it's a subscription scope resource. So I can't deploy a resource group to a resource group. I need to deploy a resource group to a subscription. So I could build a template, scope it to a subscription, deploy my resource group, and then nest inside of here another template. And then for this value here of the resource group, it would be the name of the resource group that I defined up here. And then notice that my nested template has a deployment scope of deployment template, which is really resource group. And so in here, I could do something like now define a storage account. And this storage account, based on this property right here, if it had the name of this resource group, would get deployed into the resource group that we created at the parent scope. Deploying resources at different scopes within a single file is one situation where you might want to nest templates. And again, I'm pretty confident it's there, but if it's not, it should be there. No, I don't think YAML's on the table at this point. The team, so the question in the chat is, will the YAML language replace JSON templates? And really the team is looking at actually actively looking at a proprietary language. So it won't be YAML, it will be a new language. For the VS, is there any documentation on what URLs need to be allowed through the firewall? So the VS Code extension itself, actually now it works fully offline. And what I mean by that is we used to, like as of like 6 months ago, we shipped the extension with a set of schemas. And then when you launched the extension or when you launched VS Code, we would go out to a CDN and download any additional schemas that you need. In just the spirit of full transparency, we were having an issue with, we believe, the CDN. I don't know, we didn't really come to a conclusion in what the issue was, but we were having some issues in downloading those additional schemas as well. You know, your VS Code installation was not fully up to date because there were still schemas to download. So what we're doing now is we're shipping the set of schemas with the extension, and we're just having more frequent updates, or we're releasing more often and keeping those up to date. But we are going to ultimately revisit downloading schemas dynamically without having to release a new update of the extension. So I don't know that there's really anything that you need for the extension in terms of, you know, firewall rules. However, you know, if you are going to do a deployment or anything, which is, you know, if we're just going to use like the console and in PowerShell and the Azure CLI, I would imagine there's something there. I don't really know if we've got a document, but you know, they're just HTTP and HTTPS calls. If there's something more specific that you need, definitely, you know, feel free to reach out to me and we can dig into the absolute details. If you are having an issue, either working with the extension, I mean, you can reach out to me for anything. Like I'm absolutely happy to help with anything. However, specific to that question, we can dig in further for sure if there's something else. Awesome. So I think I got all the questions in the chat. Happy to answer anything else. Again, I'll drop my Twitter handle in here. Like, I absolutely mean it. Like, you can reach out for absolutely anything. I most likely won't know the answer, but I know a bunch of people and I can help find the answer, and we are definitely here to help. If you've got feedback on ARM templates, good or bad, like I said earlier, there's a huge investment at Microsoft right now around ARM templates. We've got executive sponsorship all the way up. I mean, people like Mark Rosanovich and Brendan Burns are incredibly plugged in, and we do know that historically, you know, these things there is a learning curve to them. I mean, just looking at the one that we have on screen right now, there's a lot going on, and there's a ton of momentum right now to make this an awesome experience, and we're already executing on that. However, if you do have feedback, if you do want to talk, not just to myself, but our platform team, everybody's willing to listen. And then, big help to me if anybody is using Visual Studio to author ARM templates. Like, I would absolutely love to talk to you. And if things were better, I would buy coffee and pizza to have those conversations. But we're all stuck in our houses right now. Cool. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Not as fun as hanging out in person, but it's still cool that we're able to do this type of stuff, and connect and do these like low pressure sessions, and share knowledge. So thanks a bunch for having me. That's all I got.
Thanks so much, Neil, for presenting. That was really educative. Does anyone else have questions? Lakmal, Anjana, do you have anything else to add on?
No, I'm good. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We'll catch you next time.
Yep. Thanks a lot. It's been fun.
Bye.
Thanks, Neil.
Yep. Thanks. See you.
Bye. Bye.